Welcome to the Easier Way to Sell presentation of Close the Deal Without Selling. Here's your host and developer of the Easier Way to Sell, Ike Krieger.
Hey, this is Ike Krieger. Welcome back. Let me tell you what's in store for you in episode 39 of the Close the Deal Without Selling podcast. You're about to discover a new jewel in the R&R section of the Yes formula. We also have a segment where I answer the question, who says it's the easier way to sell? In addition, we'll address how to increase your ability to gain agreement without conflict. And I'll share a little story to remind you why we're told from an early age to let the buyer beware. We'll close with a segment on breaking down big concepts into smaller concepts. It's a kind of breaking goods segment. Enjoy. I'm always on the lookout for content that'll help guide you on the road to becoming a more effective communicator. And we're going to talk about a couple of those ways in this episode, and both will touch on the rapport and the relationship portion of the easier way to sell. As those of you who've been listening to these podcasts know, this system is not really the way most people sell naturally, and it should be. The system I've made available for you to learn is really nothing more than a communications model that helps you reach agreement with others without stress, without frustration, and without conflict. And that's why this simple process happens to work wonderfully when you use it to sell your offering of any kind. I know that the topic of this segment is one that you'll find helpful because I know I did. The topic is called chunking, and that's spelled C-H-U-N-K-I-N-G, as in chunking. Now, there's some accompanying information about chunking in your action guide, but basically, chunking gives you the opportunity to meet people at their model of the universe. As we've discussed before, it's important to discover on what channel your prospect receives and processes information most effectively, because once you determine that channel, your ability to deliver your communication effectively is elevated. And chunking is the product of an NLP, neuro-linguistics programming exercise by the same name. Chunking helps you move effortlessly and almost elegantly between levels of critical importance as you're communicating with others and even with yourself. Chunking allows you to move from the general to the specific and the other way around. I was talking to Jenny about what I was planning on sharing with you in this segment, and I gave her a quick overview of chunking. And she replied, "Oh, you're talking about outlining." As usual, she was right on. I hadn't thought to reframe chunking in that way, but when you think about an outline, you have the first topic, which is all-encompassing, and everything below it, everything you see as you move down the outline progresses from the general to the specific. And chunking is a communications tool which helps you move from the general to the specific and the other way around based on the chunking preferences of your listener. Those who like their information delivered in a form that fits more into the general topic of the outline, those people are called big chunkers. Those who communicate the specifics of the outline and like the specifics of the outline are known as small chunkers. And here's a story specific to big chunkers and small chunkers. A husband and wife, Janet and Sam, are having a hard time communicating, and that's causing a negative impact on their relationship. You see, Sam only replies in short sentences, and Janet interprets those types of responses as a lack of willingness to have a meaningful conversation. Janet would love a better and broader relationship, and she tells that to Sam, and they agree to speak to a counselor. After hearing this tale of marital distress, the counselor easily spots the communications breakdown. Janet is a little chunker. Sam is a big chunker, and the counselor reveals this insight. You, Janet, are a demonstrative speaker and Sam is not. You get upset when Sam is not more expressive and more specific, and Sam gets upset because you're too demonstrative and too specific. For instance, if Sam asked you if you'd completed your errand at the hardware store, you might go into detail about the difficulty in finding what you were looking for, the conversation with the clerk, what you did while that clerk went to find a replacement, and finally, upon the clerk finding out what it was you set out to buy, you share a story about waiting in a long line to check out. Now, if the tables were turned and you asked Sam if he completed the errand at the hardware store, the response would most likely be, yes. You see, you're a little chunker and Sam is a big chunker. The counselor went on to explain the distinction. And once Janet and Sam realized how this difference in their communication styles impacted their lives, they each made a commitment. They decided to adapt to each other's preferences. Sam agreed to respond with more than fine or it was okay. Sam was open to adding a few smaller chunks and more specificity. Janet was willing to shorten her communication into bigger chunks with less specificity, and that made Sam feel happy. A few weeks later, they were out sitting on their balcony, sipping on their favorite beverages, and Janet began a story about an exciting event she had attended that afternoon. She immediately launched into a detailed description. However, she quickly caught herself and apologized to Sam for this barrage of small chunks. Sam, with a smile on his face, said, "No, go ahead. I'm in a small chunk mood." They proceeded to have a fun and memorable conversation in which each shared both big and small chunks alike. Sam and Janet knew on which chunk channel each of them preferred to communicate and adjusted accordingly. Now that's a cute story, but basically it boils down to some people like their information given specifically and others like it given generally. How do you like your information delivered? Big chunks or small chunks? Jenny is a big chunker. I'm a small chunker. Speaking of Jenny, she just poked her head into the studio and asked if I needed to say the word chunks so much. My answer for this segment is yes. Speaking of this segment, we'll return to the subject of chunking a little later in the episode. My friend Andrew Sokol and I were talking last week on the telephone, and he asked me the marketing questions of questions. Andrew is a former student of mine, a former business partner, and I'm sure you remember him as a guest in an earlier episode where we had a great conversation that covered our unique take on marketing and branding. But Andrew's questions on that phone call were marketing challenges related to all of the information I'm providing you in these episodes. He asked, why should people listen to Ike Krieger? Why should people do or even believe what you say? And he went on to remind me that there are a lot of sales training alternatives for people who have to sell to make a living. He then asked the signature marketing question. In a world filled with competition, why you? Well, I'm going to share my answer with you in a second, but first I'll suggest that you consider all of Andrew's questions yourself. Picture these questions being asked of you personally. I invite you, I urge you to come up with the answers that satisfy these challenges posed by this important self-inquiry. So, what would make anyone want to listen to my point of view? It was really the perfect question at the perfect time. Then he asked, what's your differentiator? Then he asked, what's your value proposition? What is the deliverable? And I'll get to those answers in a second because the questions kept coming. Is it usable? Is it useful? Is it understandable? Is it learnable? Is it effective? Well, I say D, all of the above. Another question Andrew asked is, what do you mean it's the easier way to sell? Who says? Easier compared to what? Well, that conversation gave me a lot to think over, especially the question, why is your system the easier way to sell? Well, here's the answer. You may not be one of the many people who are using my system, and there are numerous programs out there that teach effective ways to increase sales success. And when stressed out salespeople discover these new ways to sell, they're eager to use them, except for one issue. You have to learn a new way to sell. You have to learn a new way to sell in order to use a new way to sell. And a new way to sell means you have to change your existing sales habits. Plus, you have to commit to something you probably haven't done since you finished your formal education. And you know what that is, right? You have to learn a new skill set. Plus, you have to commit to something you probably haven't done since you finished your formal education. And you know what that is, right? You have to learn a new skill set. When's the last time you learned something new, like a new language, or a musical instrument, or ballroom dancing, or gourmet cooking? And if you're like pretty much, everybody else, you haven't done any of those things since you got out of the educational system. You may have dabbled, but that was it. And we all have our reasons, you know? But back to selling, back to the big question. What makes this system the easier way to sell? I just mentioned all the sales training opportunities out there that teach you how to sell more effectively. But that approach is distinct from what you learn here. I proudly call this the easier way to sell because you don't have to learn a new way to sell. You just have to learn how to stop selling. With the easier way to sell, you get to stop doing what you call selling, especially the way you've been doing it, especially if the way you've been doing it stresses you out and frustrates you. Remember the joke? A man tells his doctor, "It hurts when I go like this." And the doctor replies, "Well, don't go like that." See the connection? Use my communication system and you get to stop selling. Plus, you're provided with a simple alternative you already know how to do. Put this all together and voila, a podcast called Close the Deal Without Selling. You get to stop the whole vicious cycle where you give a presentation, overcome objections, and then close. Wash, rinse, repeat. Give a presentation, overcome objections, and then close. You'll stop selling. You'll stop closing. You'll stop getting objections. You'll learn a different way to gain agreement, and you'll do it without selling and without conflict. Gaining agreement without conflict, stress, or frustration is difficult for most salespeople, and your frustration and stress is a byproduct of the way you learn to sell your offerings or yourself. The old-fashioned way to sell has conflict written all over it. The old-fashioned way to sell is so zero-sum. Does it hurt when you sell like that? Well, don't sell like that. The people you sell to don't like the way you sell to them now anyway, and in most cases, you don't like the way you sell to them either. You wish you had a better approach, better results, and an easier way to sell. So, why is this system easier? Why is this training unlike all other sales trainings? It's different because you replace your current selling strategy with something you already know how to do, but hadn't thought of yourself. Those of you already using the system know this to be accurate. Here's your ultimate differentiator. In a world filled with sales trainers, I provide the only system that teaches people how to stop selling and yet close more deals. Well, this was a good exercise for me, and I believe it's a good exercise for you. And I want to give a shout out to Andrew for posing the challenge in the first place. Well, I found myself on the buying side of a transaction not long ago. I had a project I was working on and I needed a specific part taken care of, and I felt more comfortable jobbing it out. So I found someone on the internet. We had a meeting, both televised and also over the telephone, and televised meeting, he showed me his work and it was great. And I was very pleased, asked what the next step was. He said, give him a deposit. So I went ahead and gave him the money and we set up a time for him to get me my deliverable. Well, that time came and there was no deliverable, and there were reasons and there were excuses, and there was even blame placed on me because I supposedly didn't get all of the information to the person I was supposed to. So I'll take responsibility for that. But bottom line, this person did no work for me. So I take full responsibility. I'm a grown-up, and I should have known better. So the first thing that came to mind was not being upset at this guy, was not being upset with myself, but of course, a joke. A guy dies, goes straight to heaven, standing with St. Peter, and St. Peter says, "Welcome, welcome." He goes, "You're sure you want to remain with us here in heaven? I would like to give you a tour." And he takes the guy on a tour, and he shows him heaven. And heaven is exactly what you'd picture heaven to look like. And St. Peter said, "You do have the option of going to hell if you would like." And the man goes, "Why would I want to do that?" He goes, "I don't really have an answer to that, but if you'd like, I'm sure you can go and take a look before you make your final decision." And the guy says, "All right, I'll do that." And all of a sudden, the guy's down in hell. He's met by the devil, and the devil's a cool guy, and the devil says, "Come on, let me take you on a tour." And he takes him on a tour and shows him golf courses and spas and clubs that he can join. It's just marvelous. Everything about the place is tops. And the man looks at the devil and he says, "This is really great, but I think I'd better go up and talk to St. Peter before I make my decision, but I really thank you." And the devil transports him back up to see St. Peter, and he tells St. Peter, "Look, it's beautiful up here in heaven, but I was really surprised to find out how wonderful hell looks when you actually take a tour." St. Peter goes, "Well, the decision is yours. I cannot guide your afterlife for you." And the man says, "Thank you." And he says, "Please transport me back down to hell." And he does. And he finds himself in the waiting room, and he's given a sheaf of papers to sign, and he does, and everything's all taken care of. And the devil walks in and goes, "Well, hello, follow me." And they walk through the door, and they're into hell, and it's fire and brimstone and people screaming and crying, working under slave conditions. And the man looks at the devil and says, "Wait a minute, what's going on? I was just here, and you showed me golf courses and spas and clubs that I could go to, and what happened?" The devil looks at him with a devilish grin and said, "You were a prospect then. Now you're a client." So please remember, the easier way to sell is about solving your prospect's problem, not yours. And I believe that the person that I was working with was a little more concerned about solving their problem than mine. So remember, solve people's problems and your problem gets solved too. Plus, I just love that joke. Okay, let's get back to chunking. In a moment, I'm going to share with you an example of chunking that you've been using your entire life, but may not have recognized as chunking. But first, I want to tell you about a study that was done some time ago that showed that the human brain, your brain, is capable of holding 7 pieces of individual thoughts or information at any given time. And that means 7 plus or minus 2 thought tracks exist in your brain at any given moment, plus or minus 2. Now, here comes some other thought track flying into your mind. Sometimes you don't even know where it comes from, but it enters and it takes hold in your brain reservoir, which is holding your 7 tracks or your 9 tracks or your 5 tracks. And when that happens, one of the existing tracks in your mind is forced to vanish, at least momentarily. And this might provide a clue as to what makes us say, "Hey, I forgot what I was thinking about." Now we know. Okay, let's get back to the chunking example that up till now was unrecognizable in your life. To identify this chunking example, let's look at the general topic of communicating with others, which is a wonderful choice since that's what this podcast is all about. Okay, here's the question. In your day-to-day life, in what ways do you make contact with others? Well, one general area used to make contact with others might be a communications device. An additional general area might be a communications service. A more specific service for making contact with others might include snail mail or email, but let's focus on the general area of a communications device, a device used to contact others. Now, let's chunk down from a communications device used to contact others, and a more specific device to contact others might be called, a phone. What is needed to contact others on that communications device called a phone? Well, you need an identifier to help the device reach the correct contact, and that leads us to the most famous of all chunking devices. And I don't know if famous is the right word, but certainly the most notable of all chunking devices, and that is the common 7-digit telephone number. How do you chunk a phone number identifier so you remember it? You break it into chunks. You move from the general to the specific, and some smart person at the phone company early on said, if we take those 7 digits and chunk it into 2 separate parts, this identifier code will be easier for people to remember. This 7-digit number can be easily chunked into a section of 3 numbers and another section of 4 numbers. You see where I'm going with this? These smaller sections of a phone number are considered a chunk down to specificity. So you have this 7-digit phone number. You chunk down to 3 digits. And then below that level, you have the remaining 4 digits. And that correct combination of chunks makes the call go through while making the phone number easier to remember. As you continue to chunk down the phone number, you come to individual digits, and these individual digits by themselves may not be easier to remember than a 3-chunk and a 4-chunk. When you take a phone number and chunk down to its individual digits, you're going from the general to the specific. However, if I were moving up from the specific to the general, and I'm still talking about phone numbers, I might be asking, in what technology basket might you throw a phone number? What else would you find in that next upper level container along with a phone number? Now stick with me here. What is a phone number? Let's look at it as a code you need to complete a task. No results without the code. So, what else is in this container called codes? I looked up the definition of code, and it says that a code is a system of words, letters, figures, or other symbols substituted for other words, letters, etc. What are other codes that cause successful communication or action to take place? That might be a password, an email address, your URL, or a secret code, or even words themselves. Pick a random book. That's our general topic. How would you chunk down from the general? Well, you could chunk down to a chapter, you could chunk down to a paragraph, and then you can chunk down to a word. Chunking up from the book might lead you to a bookshelf or a library or a publisher or a printing press. Just remember, bigger concept is up and the smaller concept is down. But let's focus on the communications code that allows you to unlock the meaning of the book. Words. A word is nothing more than a code. A word is a set of symbols we've given to an idea or a thing. Words were made up to give meaning. Words are passwords to human understanding. Both spoken and written words play an important role in your success, and the coding of these words must be exact in order for you to communicate as effectively as possible. Spelling words correctly falls under the topic of exact coding. So, right on cue, here is a chunking technique for remembering how to spell words that are tough to spell. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard about chunking, it was in relationship to effective spelling. And the word that was used to teach the concept was Albuquerque. Albuquerque is not an easy word to spell. But let's use chunking to make the word Albuquerque easier to spell. The word Albuquerque is a chunk-filled word. The name we've assigned to those word chunks are, or is, syllables. First, visualize the word Albuquerque, and now spell the word. probably still a challenge. Now, visualize the word Albuquerque broken down into chunks in the form of 3x5 cards sitting on your kitchen table. This will make your task simpler. On one of the 3x5 cards, you have a chunk called AL. On the second card, you have a chunk BU. Then on the third, you have a chunk QUER, and on the fourth, you have a chunk QUE. Now, let's look at each one of those separately. Visualize and spell the third chunk. QUER, of course. And what's the first chunk? AL. What's the last chunk? QUE. Now, using chunks, spell the word Albuquerque backwards. Didn't expect to do that, did you? Your ability to divide a communication or a word or a task or a business concept into its component parts so you can either comprehend that communication more easily or help someone else comprehend that communication more easily is a fantastically useful tool. Plus, it's a great way to elicit information. There's one more segment about chunking that I'm going to share with you, and I've decided to do that in the next episode. And it does concern the actual use of chunking in your sales conversation. But for now, make sure to review the portions of the action guide devoted to chunking. There's a bit of additional information in the guide that'll boost your ability to chunk effectively. Well, this episode was certainly wide-ranging. I'd like you to start looking for ways to employ chunking to elicit information from your prospects. And I'll tell you in advance, one of the exercises for our next episode focuses on how to use open-ended questions to make your chunking super effective. Make sure you go back over the questions in your notes or get a copy of the Close the Deal Without Selling podcast action guide, which has pages upon pages of these powerful open-ended questions. This is Ike Krieger. See you next time.